Global citizenship education nurtures the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes necessary for learners to contribute to a more inclusive, justice, and peaceful world. The International Conference on Global Citizenship Education brings together stakeholders from around the world to share transformative pedagogies and best practices. It aims to foster discussions on effective implementation of GCED, promote the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, and facilitate the exchange of diverse ideas.
올해 국제회의에서는 다자주의 문제를 다루게 되는데요.
The conference seeks to explore the role of GCED in addressing global challenges such as conflicts, hate speech, inequality, and climate and environmental issues through multilateral efforts. Audrey Osler, Emeritus Professor at the University of Leeds, will deliver a keynote speech on hope, justice, and compassion in a fractured world, reviewing our role as global citizenship educators. We look forward to your participation in the 9th International Conference on GCED.
Welcome to the 9th International Conference on Global Citizenship Education. I am Ji-Sun-mi from the Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding under the auspices of UNESCO, also known as ICED. This conference is co-organized by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and ICED in partnership with UNESCO and Chungnam National University BK21 Ford Center for Global Citizenship Education and Research. The 9th International Conference aims to amplify the role of GCED as a catalyst for multilateral solutions to build peaceful, just, and sustainable societies. In today's world, we are witnessing real-time threats, such as the threat of bombs falling on one's roof at any time, the threat of losing one's homeland due to climate change or war, and the threat of hatred and discrimination in the faithless online world. These emerging and pressing issues call for collective action for transformation. Therefore, this conference strives to provide you with opportunities to delve into specific cases of transformative pedagogy, multi-level collective actions, and inclusive and participatory approaches across all sessions. We sincerely hope to facilitate active discussions and generate actionable insights toward the revitalization of multilateralism for peace. Now, let us begin the opening ceremony. First, I would like to invite the Honorable Mr. Oh Seok-hwan, Vice Minister of Education, Republic of Korea, for his opening remarks. Unfortunately, due to his duty, Mr. Oh could not be present in person today, but he sent us a video message. Let's meet Mr. Oh on screen.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 교육부 차관 오스칸입니다. 제9회 세계시민교육국제회의에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 진심으로 감사와 환영의 인사를 드립니다. 이번 국제회의를 함께 준비해 주신 홍석인 외교부 공공외교대사님, 관계자 여러분, 그리고 임현묵 유네스코 아태교육원 원장님과 멀리서 환영의 말씀을 전해주신 스테파니아 지아니니 유네스코 교육 사무총장 보님께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 아울러 기조 강연을 맡아주신 리즈대학교 오드리 오설로 교수님과 각 세션의 연사분들께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 대한민국은 2015년 인천 세계교육포럼을 계기로 평화, 인권, 문화 다양성 등의 보편적 가치를 이해하고 실천하는 시민 양성이라는 세계 시민교육의 확산을 위해 노력해왔으며 이러한 노력을 국제사회와 공유하기 위해 2016년부터 세계시민교육국제회의를 개최해 오고 있습니다. 올해 9회를 맞이한 이번 국제회의는 세계시민교육으로 그려보는 다자주의 회복과 평화를 주제로 글로벌 사회가 직면한 도전 과제를 해결하기 위한 다자협력의 필요성을 재조명해 보고자 합니다. 현재 국제사회는 지정학적 갈등과 기후변화, 사이버 안보 등 다양한 국제적 이슈에 직면하고 있습니다. 이러한 문제들은 한 나라의 힘으로 해결할 수 없고 모두의 힘을 합쳐 해결해야 하며 이 과정에서 다자적 협력의 촉매제로서 세계 시민교육의 역할이 매우 중요하다고 할 수 있습니다. 세계 시민교육을 통해 우리 모두가 서로 이해하고 협력하며 포용, 존중, 공동체 의식의 가치를 더욱 확산해야 할 것입니다. 대한민국 역시 이러한 인식 아래 유네스코 아태교육원과 협력하여 고등교육기관의 세계시민교육 강좌를 개설하고 각국의 세계시민교육 교육 과정 개발을 지원하는 등 다방면으로 노력해 왔습니다. 이번 국제회의가 교육의 잠재력을 더욱 발전시키고 다양한 국가와 지역에서 이루어지는 실천 사례와 경험을 공유하는 중요한 기회가 되기를 바랍니다. 여러분의 지혜와 경험이 모여 세계시민교육이 다자주의 회복과 평화 실현에 중요한 역할을 할 수 있도록 하는데 큰 도움이 되기를 바랍니다. 다시 한번 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀을 드리며 의미 있는 행사가 되기를 기대합니다. 감사합니다.
We thank the Honorable Mr. Oh for his encouraging remarks. Now, I'd like to invite His Excellency Mr. Hong Seok-in, Ambassador and Deputy Minister for Public Diplomacy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. Please welcome His Excellency Ambassador Hong with a big round of applause.
Distinguished guests and colleagues, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the 9th International Conference on Global Citizen Education, or collaborative endeavor by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Education in partnership with UNESCO and Chungnam National University. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the UNESCO Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding for orchestrating this wonderful event. This year's theme, Revitalizing Multilateralism for Peace through GCED, is timely and meaningful, given the multiple challenges such as immigration and migration, discrimination, hate speech, and AI ethical dilemma that requires our collaboration globally. Discussions and workshops on sharing best practices and improving pedagogical guidelines will empower us to stand firm against the myriad challenges we face by promoting the values of empathy, tolerance, and civil participation. In May, Korean government decided to make a contribution of total of $6 million over the next 6 years to support UNESCO's activities in promoting the GCED, including the potential creation of UNESCO Prize in the field. Subject to the approval of the UNESCO Executive Board, the prize will be awarded to individuals or organizations who have demonstrated outstanding efforts in enhancing GCED. Opportunity to showcase good practices and exemplary works in global citizenship education will help implement SDG 4.7 and the recommendations on education for peace, human rights, sustainable development adopted by the UNESCO General Conference last year. As you may know, the Republic of Korea once was a beneficiary of UNESCO's educational aid program. UNESCO provided textbook for students in the aftermath of the Korean War. Among those students was former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. 58 years later, he disseminated the concept of the GCED, which became a powerful tool that encourages individuals to take action for a more sustainable future for all. We believe this is a prime example of the transformative power of education and the virtuous circle it can inspire. I'm personally confident our collective efforts will pave the way for nurturing global citizenship who can address the complex challenges of our interconnected world. And the Republic of Korea stands ready to commit to this noble cause. I'd like to bring my remarks to a close by reiterating my belief that educational seeds we plant today will bloom into more just and harmonious society tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your inspiring remarks. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education of the UNESCO, for her congratulatory remarks. Ms. Giannini has kindly sent us a video message all the way from Paris. Let us watch Ms. Giannini's video message on screen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to have the opportunity, at least at distance, by video message, to share a few reflections on the important topics we are discussing in Seoul this week. Our shared humanity and our planet face, as we all know, a web of interconnected challenges, from the corrosive forces of hatred, discrimination, racism, and armed conflicts, to the pressing crisis of climate change, inequality, and the disruptive impacts of the digital revolution. To overcome these threats and achieve lasting peace, we must envision and forge new pathways. Enduring peace is not merely the absence of violence, it's the presence of conditions that foster solidarity, inclusion, equality, and justice. These conditions thrive on the foundation of positive participatory attitudes, mindsets, and values, all of which are cultivated through education. Transforming education actually is one of the most powerful tools for nurturing peace, fostering international understanding, and promoting cooperation. This educational transformation, much like challenges we face and the hopes we hold, demands a multilateral approach. The 2023 recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development, as you know, unanimously adopted by UNESCO member states last year, proves that multilateralism can succeed. The recommendation provides kind of roadmap for imagining education, and implementing the recommendation is very much one of our main objectives in the coming months. It harmonizes various approaches and calls for comprehensive, transformative, and humanistic vision of education that supports long-lasting peace. At the heart of this call to action is obviously global citizenship education, which is a very core also of the mandate of APCU in the country. GCED lays the essential foundation for building inclusive and democratic society that uphold human rights and fundamental freedoms. It embodies multilateralism and international understanding, and it's the way to capture the myriad ways human beings connect, relate, and understand solidarity beyond their, let's say, immediate surroundings. GCED pedagogies and practices inspire values of common humanity, empathy, and mutual respect. And these are the main, let's say, core values of our organization. Its approach cultivates curiosity, critical understanding of the world, and the civic capacities necessary to address our shared challenges to peace. Well, I would like to congratulate the Asia-Pacific Center for International Education and the government of the Republic of Korea for organizing this 9th International Conference on Global Citizenship Education, Revitalizing Multilateralism for Peace through Global Citizenship. Your leadership, please believe me, in transforming education through GCED is essential more than ever for fostering positive social transformation on a global scale and supporting UNESCO efforts to make also this recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development, let's say, our lighthouse in the coming months and years. I thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much for your warm message, Ms. Giannini. Last but not least, I would like to invite Mr. Im Hyun-mook, Director of UpStayU, to the stage for his welcoming remarks. Please give him a big round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. Mr. Hong Seok-in, Ambassador and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Korea, Ms. Ha Yu-kyung, Director General of the Global Education Planning Bureau of the Ministry of Education, Korea, Professor Peter Ngure, Ambassador of Kenya to UNESCO, Ms. Cecilia Barbieri, Chief of the Section for Global Citizenship and Peace Education, UNESCO, Professor Audrey Asler, speakers, workshop facilitators, and moderators, dear participants, colleagues, and friends. Good morning again. Welcome to the ninth International Conference on GCED being held under the theme of Revitalizing Multilateralism for Peace through GCED. I thank the Ministry of Education Korea and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Korea for their continuing support for this annual gathering of GCED stakeholders from all around the world. I also thank UNESCO for its unwavering partnership for this conference and for the promotion of GCED as well. This year, we have a special partner, Chungnam National University, Korea, and I thank the university for its support and partnership. Dear participants, colleagues, and friends, we have chosen this year's conference theme, Revitalizing Multilateralism for Peace through GCED, as the Summit of the Future will be held later this month at the UN headquarters, New York, to reinvigorate multilateralism. Today, multilateralism is weakening as demonstrated by the UN's response to the wars in Ukraine and Palestine. Instead, we are seeing a small number of countries sharing interests and values, strengthening strategic alliances and cooperation. This so-called minilateralism is on the rise at the expense of global solidarity and cooperation, which is needed more than ever to address complex global crises we are facing together. Indeed, these complex and interconnected crises are urging us to reinvigorate multilateralism for peace and sustainable future of humanity and planet Earth. However, what we are witnessing today is growing trends of fragmentation and confrontation, soaring suspicion and mistrust, raising hate and anger against others within and across nations. As educators, education policymakers, researchers, and youth actors, what should we do to respond to this critical situation? From UNESCO's perspective, promoting mutual understanding and fighting against ignorance and prejudice, suspicion and mistrust between nations are fundamental to international peace. And education is given a crucial role in this approach. Instead of propagating and inciting suspicion and mistrust, education can help peoples better understand each other and lower anxiety and hate against other nations. But this vision of peace through education has not always been welcome. Many believe that world affairs are too complex for school students and even others to comprehend. They further point out that some of the content of peace education, education for international understanding, or global citizenship education are quite controversial and sensitive, and they should be kept out of the classroom. Moreover, they believe that teaching young people too much about the value of peace will lead to a naive generation who do not pay attention to the threats of hostile nations. Despite these objections and hesitation, education for peace has never been stopped in schools and communities. And more recently, global citizenship education, GCED, is given priority in the project of peace through education. Particularly, GCED can make an important contribution to revitalizing multilateralism by equipping learners of all ages, young and old, with knowledge and perspectives with which to critically analyze the root causes of the complex crises and values and skills with which to build solidarity and take collective action beyond national boundaries to tackle such root causes. All this learning process is greatly facilitated by the notion of global citizenship, which recognizes our common humanity and reinforces a sense of interconnectedness of our lives. Dear participants, this annual GCED conference is to highlight and strengthen the role of GCED in the light of today's rapidly changing situation and share and exchange ideas and experiences in that regard. I hope that through this conference, we can encourage and inspire each other not to lose hope, but to continue our joint efforts to practice GCED in the current context where multilateralism is weakening and threats to peace and sustainable future are growing. Thank you again, all the participants, speakers, workshop facilitators, moderators, and co-organizers and partners for being with us here at this conference. Thank you for your commitment and contribution to GCED. Let me close my remarks by quoting a saying that one social scientist who passed away recently put on his refrigerator. All kinds of little people doing little acts in little ways, in little places, have changed the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Im. Through your welcoming remarks, I believe we have gained a clear understanding of the importance and objectives of this conference. This is the end of the opening ceremony. Now, I would like to begin the first segment of the conference. I am honored and pleased to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Audrey Osler, Emeritus Professor at the University of Leeds. She is a renowned writer and scholar with 40 years of experience in human rights and global citizenship education. Professor Osler has served as an advisor to the Council of Europe, UNESCO, and various governments, and has taught globally. She's a prolific author whose works are translated into many languages such as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Professor Osler recently published Where Are You From? No, Where Are You Really From? Exploring Migration and Belonging. Professor Osler will give a keynote speech entitled Hope, Justice, and Compassion in a Fractured World, reviewing our role as global citizenship educators. Please welcome Professor Audrey Osler with a warm round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very, very honored to be giving the opening keynote speech at this conference. And it's lovely to see you all here this morning, all interested in global citizenship education. And I'm very grateful to the Republic of Korea, the government, UNESCO, and APSIU for this invitation, and very excited to have the opportunity to meet many of you over the coming 2 days. My title, Hope, Justice and Compassion in a Fractured World, Reviewing Our Role as Global Citizenship Educators. And when I began to prepare for this conference, I thought quite a lot about multilateralism and had a deep concern, as we've just heard, that multilateralism is failing in a way, is not achieving what we'd hoped for in the past. And so what I hope to do a little bit today is to suggest to think deeply about that word and to think about multilateralism, not just between governments, but also between citizens. Multilateralism is something which, when there are more than 3 people working together, they can achieve. And that really has been my starting point and thinking behind this morning's session. So for those of you who, like me, may have come a long way and may be a little jet lagged, my very, very short message today is to focus on what might achieve hope, justice, and compassion, to think about this fractured world we're living in, and to suggest that global citizenship educators need to start listening. I'm not saying we're not listening now, but to listen more deeply to the young and to learn from our students. And I do genuinely believe that hope and achieving a sense of hope depends very much on addressing the intergenerational injustices that we encounter in our world, most obviously through the climate crisis, but other ways too, and also to focus on new ways of telling stories and new ways of looking at our world. So we've heard already that we're living in a fractured world. It impinges on all of us, including our children. And some of the features I want to explore. I then want to think about how teachers respond to this challenge and how children respond. And I will try and draw on some research to do that. I wish to, if you like, renew our understandings of global citizenship education, thinking about policy, and we have policymakers here, and you've developed very fine roadmaps for this, but to thinking how that translates into classrooms and into praxis, to think about some of the challenges and barriers to change, and then to think practically at the end about teachers and citizens multilateralism. So first of all, let's just focus for a moment on our fractured world and its impact on teachers, schools, and children. And I take 2 examples here that came very close to home. We've seen populist campaigns by politicians. Just over 8 years ago, we saw a referendum in Britain on leaving the European Union. And the picture you see on the left there shows a populist politician with a great long queue of people he's claiming are trying to get into Britain. So he's trying to build up fear about migrants. In fact, this photograph had nothing to do specifically with the United Kingdom, but he was creating fear in that referendum. And then we saw the same year the US presidential election that created a lot of hostility, fear, hate, and we're beginning to see this pattern repeated in the current US presidential election. So from leaders, we are seeing, from politicians, we are seeing some real challenges, and we must not forget that children absorb these messages like adults. And then in 2021, we saw democracy undermined with the attack on the US Capitol. And of course, we are seeing currently war in Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, and elsewhere. And these things are felt very deeply in communities and by children and discussed in classrooms. And I just like to think about what this actually means for humanitarianism and for human rights as I approach this as an educator. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that over 42,000 people have been reported as killed in Israel's war in Palestine, mostly civilians, and more than 70% of those people are women and children. And this includes journalists who are there to tell the world what's going on, who are supposed to be protected, and over 224 humanitarian aid workers, including, of course, the UNRWA employees. And we're looking now at a ceasefire, and people are very skeptical about these things as well as hopeful. There's been a ceasefire as a result of a polio outbreak and a child vaccination program. But I've heard it said in the last few days quite a few times, they're vaccinating children who might very well be killed straight after this vaccination program. So what we're seeing there is human rights standards and humanitarian standards devalued and observed as such. Already mentioned, we see the global challenge of a climate crisis, of huge intergenerational injustice, that children recognize that this world is not being protected for them in the future. We've heard briefly this morning about online threats, including AI and political interference. And AI, of course, is also used in problematic ways, including the sexual abuse of children and including the demonization of migrants and refugees. So these are really, really big challenges. And I found this graffiti in Melbourne in 2018, and I thought it was quite powerful. It shows a young girl, and she's written down the things that she's going to have to do. She's going to have to deal with the homelessness problem. She's going to think about how she might fight for marriage equity. She's looking at finding love, finding peace, being kind, compassionate. These things are all part of her hopes for the future and the pressures that she's under. So there is a direct impact on young people, and it's a very powerful one, and it can feel overwhelming. It can feel overwhelming to us as adults who can look through generations of our lives, but for young people, it can feel as though this is endless and relentless. But yet, I'm inspired by the response of young people. Children, we're told, sometimes can't deal with politics, but then we see children actively engaged in politics. And we saw in the global climate strike for the future, in 2019, school strikes urging adults to take responsibility and stop the climate change. And the young boy at the front of the picture is saying, dinosaurs thought they had time too. So this is a pressing problem. And more than 1 million people demonstrated in about 2,200 events worldwide across 125 countries. And when I was talking to young people in 2022 in Japan, university students, they were telling me that the people who were striking were really bad people. They shouldn't have been staying away from school and university. They should have been studying hard. And those particularly young people were seeing a break away from education as wrong. They were totally focused on passing exams and doing well. And their professor was genuinely shocked that the young people in his class had formed this opinion. But it says, I think, something about the pressures on young people to study despite the things they're seeing ongoing around them. And I just thought this picture, particularly the one on the left, expect resistance. So young people are fighting back against these injustices. And I think that's something that we can be hopeful about. We saw the Black Lives Matter protests. The picture on the left is from the UK, no justice, no peace. And then the picture on the right is from the United States, I believe from DC. So how does all this fit in with human rights, children's identities, and education? And just to remind ourselves, 1948, we saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that gave a central place to education as a means of enabling rights. Is that what we are achieving in our classrooms? 1989, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child didn't just spell out the right to education, but it spelled out the right to human rights education. And 2011, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training set out a working definition of human rights education as a minimal entitlement. All these things are happening. And then we have the UN Sustainable Development Goal, and we're talking about sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and culture's contribution to sustainable development. All these things we know are there in our policies. They are written there, they are being promoted, and that is a great start. But this is policy, and I'd like to think about what happens to global citizenship education policies when they're translated into national policies, and when they're translated into school policies and into teachers' practices. I just like to read these words of Eleanor Roosevelt from 1958 as some 75 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just to remind us of a starting point in education. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works, where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. I'm sure most of the people in this room are familiar with those words. And yet there remain key challenges to implementing those words in classrooms. Political opposition to unprecedented numbers of refugees and migrants, what Virtuvet has referred to as super diversity, negative public debates about diversity, integration, and multiculturalism, and the role of education in promoting national identity. At the same time as we have these wonderful initiatives from UNESCO, we have governments reinforcing exclusive senses of national identity. And we also have the securitization of education policy, which has led to problematic educational initiatives addressing radicalization, and in Europe, the targeting of Europe's Muslim populations through education, through monitoring of schools, through asking teachers to report their students if they feel that they are in danger of being radicalized. So, to review global citizenship education, I would argue that we need to have inclusive global education agendas and policies at national as well as international levels. And GCE responds to globalization in very many different ways. And my vision of that is global citizenship education founded in human rights and cosmopolitan vision, very similar to the UNESCO standpoint, but it stands in direct contrast to neoliberal policies that are being promoted across universities in the name of global citizenship education. Policies that emphasize competition, that global citizenship education is being translated as prove that you can, and that our country can get on better and that we can achieve higher standards and competition, when actually we're talking about cooperation. And these prevailing neoliberal environmental and powerful interests of the global north frequently shape global citizenship education, and it becomes very instrumental and competitive. So we're faced with broad ideas of global citizenship education and also very narrow expressions of the same. And human rights education also has the potential, I believe, to bring empathy and compassion to citizenship education, but not all the global citizenship education that is being talked about is about solidarity and human rights. In reality, there is definitely a gap between the international and the national interpretations and policy. Policies never happen as we intend. They go through a process of being revised, rewritten, rethought, interpreted by so many layers of people. And this, I think, is a challenge that we need to get to grips with. And I'd just like to reflect on the traditional citizenship education that's happening around the world in our classrooms. And it's a challenge because we invite young people to become citizens, and yet we offer them, in some countries, no route to citizenship. And some of them don't aspire to citizenship. Some of them have ambitions to, or they have a citizenship that already works for them. Some are refugees, undocumented migrants, stateless persons, and yet they go through schooling where they're told about national citizenship. Others are citizens, and yet they're made to feel excluded. And yet all these children that we're educating are holders of human rights. So I think we need to think about that when we prepare young people. And a useful way that my colleague Hugh Starkey and I have approached this is to look at human rights as a framework for citizenship learning, and to think of education for cosmopolitan citizenship or global citizenship education is in three parts. First of all, we need to talk about citizenship as a status, as a nationality It can be inclusive or exclusive, and generally the status is exclusive. You're either a citizen of Korea or you're not a citizen. You're either a citizen of Singapore or you're not. You're either a citizen of France or you are not. But there's another way of looking at citizenship, which is to say we all are holders of human rights, and to see that as an inclusive way of teaching. But citizenship isn't just a status, it's a feeling. Do young people feel a sense of belonging? And that can be physical security, psychological security, it can be social security. Do they come to school with enough to eat? Are they ready to learn? And then citizenship as a practice, and that can be inclusive, but to be included, to practice your citizenship, you need to feel secure. If you feel secure, you're ready to engage in the community. So citizenship as a status, as a feeling, and as a practice are all interrelated, and they depend one on the other, at least in terms of feeling and practice. We have the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, and we're reminded that it's learning about rights, that there's knowledge there, that it's learning through rights. Are we creating a classroom with a democratic upbringing? And are we creating school practices like student councils, respect and recognition of difference? So there's learning that's part of the school culture, part of the school practice. And then there's learning for rights, making a difference, not just being loyal patriots, but critical patriots, wanting to make the place you live, the country you live in, better, rather than just accepting it as it is. And human rights are necessarily cosmopolitan. They depend on human solidarity, and in struggles for justice, an individual that experiences a violation of the rights can't always depend on their immediate neighbor or community to support. This is a global project because we do have to stand up as citizens, not just as governments, because we can't always, as we've heard, depend on all governments to do this, to stand up for those who are not close by in order to have rights protected. The US civil rights leader, Malcolm X, argued for human rights rather than civil rights, because then anybody, anywhere on this earth can become your ally. And what he said back in the 1960s in his struggle, but which we might think about in other contexts today, we can never get civil rights in America until our human rights are first restored. We will never be recognized as citizens there until we are first recognized as humans. So to what degree are we enabling young people to find global sense of belonging and loyalty to their fellow humanity, both at home, as Eleanor Roosevelt proposed, and distantly? Now, human rights have come under a lot of criticism in recent years, and Stephen Hopgood talked about the end times of human rights. He was saying that the whole project was far too ambitious, that the whole project was unrealistic. And then we saw the tragedy of the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who wrote in a precedent way before he himself died, the culture of human rights must be a popular culture if it is to withstand and withhold the blows that will inevitably come. He wrote this in 2003, and we see those blows still coming. Human rights culture must be a popular culture if it is truly to innovate and truly to be owned at the national and subnational level. So this human rights project isn't just what happened in 1948, it's what's happening now and the energy we're putting into it right now, even as we see governments withdraw from it in some respects. So what are human rights at the very basic level? What is global citizenship education? And I understand it as human rights are an expression of the human urge to resist oppression. And some people have said, well, human rights are Western, or human rights were developed in a colonial age. But we still know that all human beings have this urge to resist oppression. Then human rights education and global citizenship education must necessarily be about supporting students to name equality, to challenge injustice, to make a difference, develop solidarities at local, national, and global levels. In other words, it has to be about action. It cannot be that politics are not for children. Children see politics, they see them happening, and as the pictures I showed you earlier demonstrate, they're engaged in this agenda. Now, there are some contradictions about teaching for human rights in schools. The Human Rights Project is cosmopolitan, it stresses our common humanity. Schooling generally is a very, very nationalist project. That is the contradiction we have to grapple with. And I think international policymakers have to grapple with this, researchers have to grapple with this, and teachers have to grapple with this contradiction. Schooling is part of a national project. We teach children the national history, national myths, national symbols. Most countries, you know where you are when you get off the plane, because that's what you see. You see you get taught a national literature, there's a national media. In most countries in the world, there's a national military, and there's often a national religion. So we are facing a huge contradiction. The other challenge is that human rights are often taught as them and us. So my colleague Keynote Vesterdal in Norway observed that teachers consider human rights abuses in Norway as peanuts, as nothing important. It's about human rights in other parts of the world. So they teach about human rights abuses elsewhere, and they assume everything's fine at home. And I can assure you from the point of view of minority students that they don't feel that everything is right at home. So there is that challenge, that them and us challenge. Then we have the problem in our classrooms that still teachers think of children and equality as sameness. I treat them all as children. I don't see differences. I heard that when I started teaching decades ago, and I still hear it today. It ignores the structural inequalities, the different learning needs, and for example, those of developing bilingual students. It ignores research, very powerful research by Geneva Gay, Gloria and Lanston Billings on culturally responsive teaching. It fails to engage with family expectations of school. Teachers on the one hand, families on the other, where is the dialogue? And the policy frameworks, for example, the one in Norway, but I don't think Norway is unique, and Norway is very proud of its human rights record, but they frequently assume that language competence will realize genuine equality. If you learn to speak the language well, if you learn to speak Korean, if you learn to speak English, if you learn to speak Norwegian, everything will be fine, and then we'll have equality. We've observed that that doesn't actually do the job. There's much more to achieving equality and inclusion. So I've looked at some challenges, and I want to look a little bit more at barriers to change. And I want to think about education and human rights within broader research contexts. We need to, I would argue, bring together conceptual frameworks for around scholarship and the struggles for justice. I think one of the problems of the human rights framework, if you like, is that it doesn't deal with the inequalities of power. It doesn't deal with asymmetrical power relations, and quite often our very fine international policies don't necessarily support teachers in dealing with inequalities of power. So we need tools for education research, which can be applied at different levels, at local, cultural levels, national, international levels. And I think we need to use a human rights framework alongside one on intersectionality so that we really understand how to teach for social justice. We've all heard a lot about universal human rights, and universality is a key concept. But many minorities fear a different word, universalizing. So universality rights apply to everybody, but minorities fear this universalizing, this feel homogenizing impact of the mainstream culture. And the asymmetrical power relations need to be acknowledged and they need to be explored. And that includes exploring those with teachers and exploring those with children. And I'm very inspired by the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha, and he helps us understand something that I've called here the narrative imagination. And I'd like us to think a little bit about narrative as a pedagogical tool. That narrative, put very simply, storytelling, can actually help us achieve our goals. All cultures have histories of stories and storytelling. We tell stories to the youngest children. Let's start telling these stories to each other as adults, and let's help our young people, our teenagers, and our university students tell stories and tell their own experiences and build their own experiences into our education framework. We need to have stories about successful and ongoing struggles for rights. Students need to be able to tell their individual stories, and from those individual stories, I believe that the transformative power of collective stories can come about. Narratives of this nature trouble this dominant national narrative, this one that we're taught to believe in. And Homi Bhabha talks about the right to narrate. Telling stories, telling a new narrative, he talks about it as a right. And he says, to protect the right to narrate is to protect a range of democratic imperatives. It assumes that there is an equal access to all those institutions, equitable access to all those institutions, schools, universities, museums, libraries, theatres, that give you a sense of collective history and the means to turn those materials into a narrative of your own. So it's about providing access for all to those institutions. And I've been playing around with this idea myself. During the COVID pandemic and during lockdown, I had no opportunity to travel the world, but I was like all of us. But I did have the opportunity to travel in my imagination and to do a little bit of time traveling through my research. And what I did was to tell the story of one family, my own family, over 3 centuries. And I went from telling a story of a family in India, Singapore, Malaysia, and the UK And what I was trying to do was to explore the difficult history of empire, in this case, the difficult history of the British Empire, which is hugely contested today. People squabble over this history today. Some people want to tell us the empire was great. Some people want us to rely on what new history is revealing, that it wasn't quite so great. And my story also addressed migration. And I found out that migrants were us. That in my family, people have been migrants in every generation back to the late 18th century. I've done a lot of work on narratives, and the book on the left, I'm very proud and very honored, is right now being translated into Korean by my dear colleague, Professor Sunan Park. And I hope and are grateful that that work has been done. But we need to look to the past and to the future, and to think about our common humanity, and to remember that greater justice can come out of these terrible things that we've seen. The first task is to imagine, and then to work towards a better future, a more just future. And we need to rethink the role of the teacher, and to recognize that teachers have moral and political obligations, and that to remember that this human rights culture must be a popular culture. And it must happen at home as well as in distant places. So we need to revitalize our schools as both cosmopolitan and multicultural. And we need to involve caring for our students. So briefly, what are the students who've done all this, what might they look like? And I would just like to conclude that students that we should be working towards is curious, confident, enthusiastic, feels part of a learning community, feels cared for, is open to new and different perspectives, knows there are always new things to learn, is knowledgeable about the arts, literature, history, and so on, is bilingual, if not multilingual, is caring, and is ready to struggle for justice. Thank you for listening. We have a few minutes for a Q&A now. And I know it's a difficult room, and I know there are lots of people here, but if there are people with questions or comments, I would love to hear them. I think there's a roving mic somewhere.
Good morning, Professor. It's Shahid Fareed here. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm representing Government of Punjab, Pakistan. Wonderful presentation, ma'am. Really honored to listen to whatever you have been presenting before us. I have a quick question. So whatever we are talking about sort of a utopian world where we are actually thinking of minusing governments, minusing cultural and religious inhibitions, and at the same time, we are planning to develop something which is global in true sense. Do you think, will this be possible in coming future?
We are facing a big challenge, but I think the very nature of the technologies are putting people in contact with each other, as well as with people from their own country and their own community. So I think that people can influence their government, not just through their vote, but through their engagement. And so I don't think things are fixed. I think history teaches us that we can have that power to make a difference. Maybe not a huge difference, but we heard a story of the scholar who talked about the small changes, the little list you put on your, celebrate the little things that you can do every day. And I think children can see that. And as we've seen children protest for climate change, I think that has powerfully put that on the world's agenda. It doesn't change things overnight, but I think it makes us aware as citizens and more responsible to each other. So it doesn't solve everything, but I think small things do make a difference.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your enlightening keynote speech. I'm Moushumi Mukherjee from Opijandal University, India. You have raised a very important fundamental contradiction in the concept of global citizenship itself by bringing discussion about citizenship, which is bounded by the boundaries of the nation state and rights and duties that this nation state puts on the citizens. Now, I could hear you bringing in human rights discourse into it. But when it comes to human rights, you have also highlighted once again the criticisms against it. Now, how can you, I'm also part of a project now, we are looking to redefine global citizenship competencies from Asia Pacific perspective. So I was just wondering, rather than talking about global citizenship education, if we would rather think in terms of competencies, would it be better? Because, you know, bringing in the concept of citizenship brings in a lot of contestations with regards to, you know, the pedagogies on the ground and also conceptual understanding for people. So I would like to hear your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the concept of citizenship is, well, the subject of citizenship in schools is a space we have to work on these things. So I wouldn't say, let's not use this space. I would say, let's use this space to good effect. Competencies, they can be used for good and for ill. We can teach certain skills. We can teach them and they can be used, for example, the skill of speaking in public can be used for good, or it can be used to cause hatred. So the competence itself is not necessarily enough. I have talked about education for cosmopolitan citizenship and suggested that that encompasses the local, the national, and the global, because we have to recognize that at all these levels, young people are encountering difference. They're encountering getting along with people in different ways. So I know that global citizenship causes problems for some teachers, because they think these children will never engage with the world. They're engaging with their local community. But if we think that the concept includes the local and the global, because the local is where we start to act. Very few of us have the privilege of acting on a global scale and on a global stage. Many of us have the opportunity to engage at a national level. So I think we have to see these as a continuum. We have to recognize the tensions and discuss those tensions together, and to see ways of understanding the nation as cosmopolitan. The nation of India is cosmopolitan. It is diverse. It is many religions, many people, many cultures together, and to recognize all of these on a continuum. So rather than seeing either this or that, I would bring the lot together. And that's why I've talked about cosmopolitan citizenship education, to encompass that The national can be rethought as inclusive, or the national can be exclusive, and it's the way you teach it.
Professor Osler, if I may be forgiven, firstly, for a moment of gratitude. My name is Karina Menzies-Ballantyne. I'm from Sikh University in Australia. And your and Professor Starkey's work, concept of cosmopolitan citizenship, and your expression, citizens in waiting, has been the very foundation of my work for years. So firstly, a thank you to you both. And my question is along those lines, because I know in Australia, we certainly had a situation where we had incredibly articulate 15-year-olds doing the school strike for climate, articulating sensible plans for the transference of resources to renewables. And then we had our own ministers and indeed our Prime Minister telling them they should be back in the classroom learning. How do we, as a community, one, get rid of this idea that learning only happens in the classroom? Two, that sometimes that balance between the good and the active or social justice citizen. And three, that our children have a voice in all of this. We need to shape talking narratives, all of those narratives, to give them a true voice.
Thank you. And in a way, I think you are answering the question for yourself. If we create structures where children can participate, and looking around this room, I don't see anybody under the age of 18 here. Maybe next year you invite them. Maybe you invite them to stand up on this stage. If we create opportunities, and I don't just mean symbolic ones like today, but I mean in our everyday working, if we build them in to our discussions, if we build forums for young people at all levels and from the youngest children, then I think we stand a chance of achieving these things. Yes, a particular Prime Minister of Australia told these kids to get back into school and said they weren't doing any good. I think the answer from many Australians was that he was wrong. And I think that came across very, very powerfully. And I think the more we include children in our debates and young people, and I do mean young children as well as the teenagers, I think the most powerful things can happen. I once went to a meeting of the Council of Europe, and it was on children's policy, and adults weren't allowed to speak in the plenaries. They could talk all they wanted in the private small groups, but in the plenaries, only children had the voice, and it was very, very powerful. I think our time is up, but I'd like to thank you for your questions and thank you for this opportunity again.
Thank you, Professor Osler, for your inspiring keynote speech. We thank you for your contribution to our understanding of global citizenship education's crucial role in shaping a more just and hopeful future. We will now take a group photo with our guest speakers on stage. I would like to invite distinguished guests. Please come up to the stage for the photo. Please move up to the stage.